Talking about here today, we deal with risk assessments, and we get into the details of that into Volume 3 on the Business Improvement Guide. So basically the text that we use for Black Belt and Master Black Belt training. So as Mallory indicated, this was the last session that we have in the 8-part series, and again it's going to be on risk mitigation. We've got a question for you when we're getting started here. How frequently to use FMEA tools in your process improvement projects? So please let us know, give us your response. Okay, a couple more seconds here. Okay, let's go ahead and close it and see what we got. Okay, it looks like that we have the 38%, so it's about a third of you that use it from 0 to 25% of the time seems to be the winner, and other than that, it's pretty well distributed there. Okay, well, thank you very much for your feedback on that particular question. So the learning objectives we have today is to look at risk assessments from a general point of view, and then we'll get into some of the key concepts from an FMEA, and then we're going to also talk about business issues that could use an FMEA. So you've maybe had in your training already some of the concepts that we talk about building an FMEA, but so this may be somewhat of a review for you, but it may also help you expedite executing an FMEA in the future. So risk assessment is basically a part of looking at risk in an overall management plan. You know, first we obviously want to assess the risk, and then you really want to look at what can be done to mitigate those kind of impacts that you might be able to have. So the purpose of it is to see what issues are out there, and then do something about them if we think those issues are of significance. So it can be affecting us on how we react to certain situations. It can be used into basically any industry. You got financial, medical, manufacturing, or whatever. And if we step back and look at from a business point of view, our financial industry did not do a very good job of risk mitigation. Now, from an individual point of view, like the CEOs of some of the financial companies, they did a pretty good job of it on an individual basis. They said, hey, we're not taking much risk here, and the rewards are really high. However, from a corporate point of view, they put the corporations in high risks, and the rewards for the particular environment they put themselves into was not very good. So this is an example when FMEAs, if it was done in an objective point of view, that could have been really beneficial. So when we think about risk, it's basically defined as a product of the severity of an occurrence occurring times the probability of occurrence. So the highest scores are something that we really want to work on. So if we got something that's really severe but doesn't happen very often, that's something that's important to us, and that could be somewhat equal to something that's less severe, but it happens an awful lot of times. So we're making this balance when we're looking at making decisions using the risk assessment. Now, if we look at it from a mathematical point of view, we could have 4 series components in a reliability component. So, for example, if we've got a machine and we've got 4 different major assemblies, we can look at the reliability of each one of those at any point in time, and then take that one reliability of one component times the reliability of another component times the third times the fourth, and so on. Then we get the overall reliability of the overall component. Now that's when you don't have a redundancy. But let's say, for example, you're dealing with the space shuttle. Okay, well, it's got a lot of active redundancy. So if one particular aspect of the shuttle would fail, then there's maybe a backup system. so you can go through and calculate what the overall reliability is whenever you consider these backup systems too. So that's basically how we'd actually calculate it. So we're looking at mathematically the probability of occurrence. So in this particular case, we've got some numbers. We know if it lives to be a certain length of time, what is the probability of it failing within the next hour or some other period of time. But often we don't have that kind of information. So just to reiterate, you must understand the probability of the failure occurring for each of the components. But for most risk assessments, you estimate the probability for a long period of time. But what do you do whenever you go in and have something that's not so much that you can calculate what it would be? So these concepts, and also the ones that you have a difficulty getting your arms around, would be applicable in design, manufacturing, medical devices, traffic. I mean, you list them out there. There's many situations that this would apply to. Now, if you don't know what the likelihood of failure is, one way of doing it is using the FMEA. Now, it was originally developed in the 40s in the military, and NASA used it as FMECA, where the C stands for criticality assessment. Ford got into it in the 70s, and the AIAG, that's an Automobile Industry Action Group, which is a conglomerate of all the U.S. car companies, they adopted it as a standard in the 80s. So there's one of their FMEA booklets that they put out that's somewhat of a standard for FMEAs. Now, AIAG calls it a potential FMEA to signify it's an analysis of a system before the failure occurs. So it's not like, again, that something's happened and we're looking at the reliability and we have good numbers. We're looking at something that potentially could occur. Now, most Lean Six Sigma programs include this part of their overall training, and it's basically required to be a supplier for some of the major automobile companies and also aircraft companies. However, I've had people in the class and they kind of respond that some of these applications almost become boilerplates. That they're going through the exercises instead of really going through the mechanics of actually putting it together. It's like, oh my goodness, I got to fill this checkbox in here. I got to do an FMEA on it. But in reality, a lot of times it's not really done in the spirit of what we're going to be suggesting here. Okay, we've got another question for you here. We'd like for you to give your response to where FMEAs are used in your organization. Okay, about half of you voted. A few more seconds here. Okay, let's close the polls here. Okay, again, we got someone, oh no, we got in process analysis. That seems like the winner for this particular one. Okay, super. So you've got, it looks like in some of them that they're used in various different areas. So there's many different kinds of FMEAs. Now the ones that we most typically encounter are process FMEA and design process FMEA. But they basically have a similar structure to them. Now we're going to be focusing primarily on a process FMEA. So that's what's shown in the upper left-hand corner. Excuse me. And then often when it's looked at it in a Lean Six Sigma deployment, you take that process and you can look at the steps and you can say, what can go wrong with those, or what could be inputs to that could have some issues, and that can kind of develop into a cause and effect diagram. Okay, and from that we can go in and do a prioritization of those on a cause and effect matrix. And from that, then we can go in and build an FMEA from that. So those items that we have listed on the cause and effect matrix can become the items on the left-hand side of the FMEA matrix that we'll be working on. Now that's one way of doing it. Now another way to do it is actually look at each one of the steps, or each of the major steps, and then that can become the driver on the left-hand side of the FMEA. So practitioners often use an FMEA as basically an independent risk assessment tool so that they can look for more potential causes. So they use the 5 whys, or in the fishbone diagram, to basically drill down to the true causes. And then, like I said, they can use the cause and effect matrix to prioritize them. And then they use the FMEA to develop the risk-based causes. So then by looking at both things together, then they can go in and look at the items that they want to evaluate further in the analyze phase. Now there's two basic types of matrices that you have. Is that you got an FMEA here, and when you come in, you can look at in this area over here. Get it over here, get a highlighter. This is the key difference right over here. So we always, in the past, we pretty much looked at current design controls. That's the matrix at the top. You've shown that right here. Now, what's more recently come out is we look at what do we have in the current controls, and then what do we have under current detection. So we'd rather have it so that we have them under control and we just don't have to monitor them to find problems. So this is kind of listed as a separate entity here. So you've got two different columns to deal with, which I didn't pass up on there. So for a process, or basically in an assembly FMEA, it's important to ensure that the appropriate focus on the design needs. Now, what's really important is to have the right people involved in the FMEA. You want to have somebody from design, the manufacturing, reliability, and so on. You want to have various cross-sections, because an FMEA can be a great tool. However, if you don't have the right people given the appropriate inputs to the overall matrix that you're building, then the thing is it's not as beneficial as it might be otherwise if you have the right team. So the process FMEA, when you get into that, what you're assuming is that the design process meets the intent of what it's supposed to basically do. And the process FMEA does not need to include the potential failure mode from the design, basically. However, an FMEA team may choose to do that, but in general it's not done. So a process FMEA can, again, originate from a flow chart. So in that case, we're looking at the characteristics of the flow that's associated with the operations. And when we want to then look at is including our appropriate product effects from the available design FMEA. So now let's look at how we actually build an FMEA. So the FMEA that we're showing here in green, at least that portion of it, basically describes what this FMEA is all about. Now if we look at the left-hand side, the column that's over there, that one really is describes basically what's happened in this particular FMEA. This is a very important column. So it concisely indicates the purpose of what we're analyzing in the process or in the operation. So this looks like we're doing the assembling, soldering, the drilling, and that sort of thing. Now, the potential failure mode is the next column that we're dealing with here. For each operation that we look at, we list each potential failure mode in terms of the component or subassembly. Now, examples that we might have is like, hey, it's broken, or there's a short, or what really is the failure mode? Now, what often happens is people get confused on the effect of that. So we said, hey, it's broken. Okay, why is it broken? Okay, it just does not fit, or it fails to open, or things like that. So we get into why we have the particular problem. So we're looking at, again, the example end user effects for the poor performance, could be intermittent, or the poor appearance. Okay, now the severity of that is we typically look at that on a scale of 1 to 10. Now we need to have an agreement before we start what is a number 1 item and a number 10 item. So if in the book I have in volume 3, I use it from AIAG. I got permission to copy from there, and it makes the criteria for an automobile. So like 10, it's it's disaster. I mean, the car blows up kind of thing. I mean, it's really severe. And number 1, it's maybe a cosmetic type thing. So for your particular environment, you have to agree to what's a scale of 1 to 10 for your severity. Now, class is kind of a special thing here. If we're dealing with government regulations and safety and that sort of thing, and we have an issue with this, and there's something that we really need to take in account and do something about, we then go in and put an appropriate character or symbol in the column so that we know that later that we need to take appropriate action on that, no matter what the other things come out in the column. So, okay, let's look at now potential causes of failure. So what do we have in that particular column? It contains a descriptive list that is complete as possible to describe all the root causes. Now, we're not talking about the symptoms here, but what is the root causes? Now, some examples of that might be human error, could be improper cure time, missing parts. So these could be the potential causes for that particular failure mode that you had and the effect. Okay, now if we get to the occurrence column, again, that's on a scale of 1 to 10. We describe the number of anticipated failures during the process execution. So we'd like to have statistical data to help us with that, to trying to look at the the likelihood that we're going to have of this actually occurring. So something could be very severe, but it may not occur very often, or something may be less severe, but it can occur a lot. So you can see how the severity column and the occurrence column kind of cancel each other out, or they need to look in combination to go in and look at it together, because we're going to get to this risk priority number. Okay, now we're going to look at the current controls that we have. Now, we may be really doing a good job controlling this overall process, so even though we have something that's very disastrous here, but if we can really control it well, then we don't have so much a problem. However, if we can't control it very well, then we got some issues. Like, for example, BP, in their they didn't have very good controls. When you stop to think about what happened, people brought attentions and issues to the management's attention. However, nothing was really done about it in a timely fashion, and it really got into a bad situation pretty quickly. So we like to go in and have it so it's poka-yoke, so it's air-proofed, but sometimes we can't really do that. And so we'd rather have prevention, versus just inspection to find the quality, because as we know, inspection is not 100% correct. So what we like to do is try to design in as much as we can relative to our current controls. And that's something that's I'm really a big believer in. That takes out the human element into it. So now if we look at detection, again, that's a scale of 1 to 10, where now we want to look at the probability of detection. So if something occurred, what's the likelihood of us detecting it? Now, when we go in, excuse me, multiply the severity times the occurrence times detection, we get the risk priority number. And that gives us an idea of what's the priorities of each of these relative to each other. So this is kind of showing what really happens over that multiplication. And so again, we end up with the risk priority number for this. Now, on the right-hand side, so what we're going to do now is we rank all the items that we came up with, and the ones that have a risk priority number above a certain criteria that we established, then those we need to take actions on. And so the columns to the right describe what kind of action we're taking, and then who's supposed to do that, and when are they going to get it done. And then we go in and look at a new severity occurrence detection number and come up with a recalculated risk priority number appropriate for the actions that we've taken. Okay, now this is an example one from volume 3 on page 510, and it's looking at the overall business operations. So as we can see that the top one we have there is shutdown. So you can see shutdown is quite a few line items there, a lot of rows. And we talked about the potential effect is lost income bankruptcy. And then we've got several lost income bankruptcy, and then see, that's the severity there. That's bad, okay? And then the potential causes, why could you have happened? Well, you got a tornado hit you. Okay, the likelihood of that occurring is pretty low. Lawsuit by a visitor, okay, that's a 3. Okay, lawsuit by a visitor owing to faulty merchandise, oh, that's a 5, so on. And then those go in and look at detection. Okay, so it looks like for the first row, we have pretty good detection. See, it's a 10. Okay, I mean, no, it's pretty poor detection. We have to remember this. On detection, it works the opposite. So if you don't have very good detection, then that's a 10. Okay, so in this case, you multiply it out, you see 270. Now, if we look at all the RPNs together, then we notice halfway down there, so we have a shutdown. It's loss of income bankruptcy, loss of lease, rental agreement on the month-to-month basis automatically renews. Okay, let's look at some mistakes in an FMEA. Oh, these allergies, it really caused me a lot of fun here today. Excuse me. Okay, one of the things that happens is confusing failure mode to failure effect. The mode is how the process failed. The effect is how the failure recognized or seen in the process. Now that's something that's really important to memorize almost, because I've seen that happen a lot of times. People get confused on the mode and the effect. Another one here we have not scoring values independently. Now severity is only about the failure's impact. So we're saying if it occurs, what is the severity of it? Okay, it's not looking at the likelihood of it. Now occurrence is only about the frequency of it occurring. So it's not dealing anything with severity. Now the third one is detectability is only about if it occurs, can I detect it? So sometimes we get a bias in there, and we might go in and impact one number by what we think another number would be. But we need to be careful we don't do that. Another thing what can happen is like the QFD, quality function deployment. You really got to be careful if too much details. You can really get down to rat holes on this if you're not careful. You want to only include the failures that are reasonable. And let's don't consider like a meteor impacts the Earth or we got a nuclear attack. Yeah, those things could occur, but the thing is, we're looking at things that are not quite that unlikelihood. Another thing you might have is we're listing all the controls rather than just going in and looking at something that's inspected or something that's documented in the process. So we're not looking at considering all the numeric controls we can have in a manufacturing operation, for example. We're not looking at all those. But we want to look at things just basically that are documented on how we're actually doing it, what are we making sure that it doesn't happen, and also the inspections that are associated with that. Another thing we can have is we can spend a lot of time over splitting hairs over the scoring of these things. So we need to go in and agree to the scoring rules before we get started. And then we kind of want to check them before we move on. Now, severity is about the impact of failure on the effect, not the severity of the failure. Okay, so severity in time to correct and quality to the process, the output. So that's kind of the thing we're looking at. So that's another thing we've got to be careful of. Yeah, I've seen this happen also is that some people want to do action items on everything. Let's go in and we want to address the ones that are just the biggest ones that we need to take on. Okay, the other thing is not filling in all the entries in a row. Just a moment. Apologize, my allergies are just giving me a hard time here today. So the other thing you can have is not filling in all the entries in the row. So if you leave those blank in the columns, you lose track of the entries, when you start sorting things out. The other thing you might have is whenever you use the same wording in there, as you saw in that previous slide I had, that we have the same wording, you need to have the same score whenever you have the same wording. That's something else to be careful, watch out for. So these are some, listed here are some guidelines, and you might find beneficial for speeding up the creation of this. So one thing you could have the subject matter expert fill out columns 1 to 3 using only the subject matter expert. So they're going to list only the known process failure modes and how they were detected in the past. And then the team gets involved in the columns like 6 and 8. So now we're doing causes and detectability. Now another thing, it's good to sleep on it. So you kind of end the meeting and then you reconvene in a few days to finish it basically. So you want to also go down and look down the columns to make sure that you're not changing your valuation of the criteria as you're going down the particular columns. Sometimes when we get later on in a particular exercise or creating a matrix, that we can change an opinion on how we're scoring some things. Okay, let's look at how do you recognize FMEA opportunity. So in the project statement, it's all about, basically reducing risk. there's really basically no data on the problem that is feared. So if you look at, you want to eliminate a failure and error. So even if you have people error, basically it's going to work. If you're looking at design effort, for example, IT, that's an example of how you might look at where can something go wrong. That's what I try to start with here, is where can something go wrong, and start looking at it from that particular point of view. Okay, this is a couple examples from Rick Haynes' real life situation. In his past life, he had a couple of explosions. One was a hydrogen buildup in a canister exploded, and they've been doing this for many eons here, and they, no one is hurt, fortunately. And then they looked at a project to make it safer, so they started looking at risks of what could go wrong, and then be able to use an FMEA to identify what could go wrong and how to change the handling of that particular device. Another example that Rick has is he goes fishing for a week-long trip in Canada, after the mosquitoes freeze and the mosquitoes get taken care of. But then they started thinking about, what happens if somebody got hurt? There's no way to get the person medical care. So they started doing an FMEA over the campfire and realized that they needed to go in and make sure they had certain pieces of equipment, because if somebody did get hurt, or broke a leg or had some sort of a trauma there with them, they needed to be able to protect that person so that they could come back and get them the next day, because it was just too far. They couldn't really carry them. So they came up with a list of items that they needed to take along with them, and so now they basically carry those all the time. So again, this was before a problem occurred that they decided what they were actually going to do. Okay, here's question number 3. Okay, let's close it up here. Okay, so it looks like it may increase my usage, so it looks like we might have been able to get Goose Bump from some of the people out there. Okay, that's good. Okay, these are topics we covered here: risk assessments in general, key concept in the FMEA, and the business issues that could use an FMEA. So what kind of questions do we have out there?
Again, please enter your questions in the text box. I know that we've got some people that are interested in using this in the future, so let's talk about potential uses or experiences you've had in the past, or any questions you might have for Forrest. Again, we appreciate your patience with some of the difficulties in Forrest allergies, but please feel free to answer any questions. We have a few minutes here, so I'll start going through them and continue to submit. Okay, the first question I have is someone that works for a company and they manufacture a high-tech device. What type of risk might an FMEA uncover when creating a new product?
Okay, good question. I think you can look at from technical risks, but you can also look from financial risks. You might uncover that, can I even sell the product? Do I have the marketing in place? What happens when I hand it over to manufacturing? What happens when I might have suppliers that's in the hurricane region in the United States? Then the thing is, if you got a chemical or if you got a device, what's the risk of things not working together? And and so I got a new technology. Is there a risk with this new technology? And so when you start looking at it from a big picture point of view, then you might say, well, gee whiz, I never really thought about it. I need to really be careful of my supplier. Or what about this? If we go in and start deciding to offshore something that's really kind of our core competency, we could be training our new competitors that we're going to be having in the future. So, to me, that might be a high risk. So we're not just necessarily looking from a risk assessment from a technical point of view, but also from a business point of view as well.
Okay, this is a comment, and it's the participant said, a team is always required to perform an FMEA. Do you have anything to add to that for us?
Well, you got different groups of thoughts on this. I know it's part of the overall roadmap, and I got very detailed roadmaps in my books and roadmaps that I have. But I personally don't think it's always necessary. Now, I know some people that are zealots in this, that they'll disagree with me, but that's just from a personal point of view. I don't believe that you need to do all the tools in your toolbox. You're not always going to do a design of experiments. And if an FMEA isn't necessarily going to add a lot of value to the project, to me personally, I don't think it's necessary. But I know that not everybody agrees with me on that. At least that's just my point of view.
Okay, another comment. The most important thing I found was the training involved at the front end of the client side. It was an eye-opener on the score development. And please correct me and add a comment. I think that you're referring to getting on the same page as far as the ranking. Is that correct? Oh, the RPN.
Oh,
with the client.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's really important when you're doing an FMEA to go in and make sure that for each of the severity and all the different scorecards, the scoring, that we're on the same page relative to doing that, because that can really obviously make a really big difference. But yes, I agree with you. That's very important. Mm-hmm.
Could FMEAs benefit our government's decision-making process? If so, how? And this is a participant's point of view, and I think maybe you could add from some of your other workforce about how this may apply to other nonprofits as well.
Yes, I think well, relative to the Iraq War, and I really don't care what your thoughts were on that, but if we went in and said, what if they don't have weapons of mass destruction? Okay, would we make the same decision or not? Okay, and that to me, I think would have been an FMEA. Now, if we'd have said yes, even if they don't, we would have still made the same decision, then that would have been the situation. But I think whenever you're making a decision to do something, that it's definitely applicable. What I think is also very important is how it can impact policies, because we set up these policies and there can lead to unintended consequences, even like the health care bills and things like that. What's the impact on that? Is there a certain risk to that? For example, that I believe in Obama's health care, it said that you got unlimited. You don't have any ceiling for the maximum amount. Now, what's the risk on that? Well, that means somebody could be spending, for something that's a life-ending situation that they might encounter millions and millions of dollars, and that's a risk. Can we afford it? Is that something we really need? But you're looking at everything objectively. Now, one of the problems you can have also with it is not necessarily everybody wants to look at it subjectively. They got their own paradigm and things that they want, or their belief system, of what it has, and that's what you can have with the Democrats and Republicans. It's a great country and we've got a great system here, but there can be some agendas onto it, and that can be in any FMEA. But I think it's really important whenever you're starting to set up policies and doing something that you look at what is the risk of doing something wrong. And I think sometimes that can uncover some unintended consequences.
Okay, we have one more question about how my FMEAs benefit me at the personal level. I think some of Rick's example, one of Rick's fishing examples spoke to this, but could you elaborate?
Well, even one thing you might consider also is your investments. Okay, you go in and say, well, I'm going to invest in this particular real estate venture or this. And then, and then you say, well, what happens if it goes south? What are the risks associated with that? And then you might start looking at the upside potential is really not worth all the risks that you're actually undertaking to actually go in and do it, because the downside implication doesn't warrant, or the downside possibilities doesn't warrant the risk that you're actually taking when you're going on and taking on this adventure. So sometimes we get emotion involved in things, business decisions or personal decisions, but this is kind of adding a little more of a left brain look at it and saying, what is the risk of us being wrong in this particular decision? And you can even do this like Rick did on his camping trip. You know, what are you going to be doing? What happens if I go on an international trip and I really need to go in and get back because I got a medical problem that's severe? Should I go in and cover insurance for that? So insurance is one way to balance this risk, but a lot of times they're trying to sell you policies on, you buy a device, even a wetback. Once I was somebody trying to sell me insurance or extended warranty on a wetback. I said, my goodness, why? You know, because I could afford to buy another wetback. However, the risk of somebody suing me for something, you know, that's if you got boats and all these other things, then the thing is that could be a lot higher. So you might want to consider an umbrella policy, because that covers you, because you say, well, if I get hit with a multi-million-dollar lawsuit, that I can't really afford very well, but I can sure afford to buy another wetback if it fails on me. So you can kind of balance that on your decision-making process to see when to actually take an extended warranty or insurance for that matter.
Okay, that's all the questions we have. So if you have anything else, please feel free to submit it in these last few minutes. If not, as always, we're available offline and can continue this discussion. We do have a feedback survey at the end when you log off. So this is a little bit different than the last few feedback surveys, so we really ask that you take the time to fill that out. This is a little bit more focused on the whole series, and we'd like to get your feedback about what you thought, the value that you received. So again, please fill that out when you exit the survey. One more comment from one of our participants is that risk management is a methodology that helps managers make best use of their available resources, and that's definitely something that we agree with, and thanks for the additional feedback. So again, if there's no other questions, we will end today, and we appreciate your active participation over the last 8 webinars, and we look forward to meeting again. So please be sure to fill out that survey so we can get your feedback on how to serve you better next time. Thanks again.